All right, everyone. So our next speaker is Miss Noopur Singh, and she is going to be giving us a presentation on clinical trials and the patient perspective and current open trials. I know that Noopur is going to focus quite a bit on the use of placebos and why placebos are used, and also how clinical trials can really take a patient-directed focus. So I believe we also have someone who is going to be in the audience after Ms. Singh gives her presentation, someone who actually is a participant in a clinical trial, so who might be able to speak as well. So let me introduce Ms. Singh. So Noopur is VP of Marketing and Patient Affairs at Zentria. In her role at Zentria, she leads business development and partnering strategy and also works to carry out patient-centered drug development that bridges scientific gaps and incorporates clinical trials that are designed to truly represent the diverse populations affected by difficult-to-treat conditions. Her approach stems from the patient journey, ensuring it is integrated throughout the drug development cycle. Ms. Singh.
Hi, everyone. I'm looking forward to giving you some of the industry perspective on clinical trial research. Clinical trials and in research, there's a lot of acronyms and lingos. Zentria is a pharmaceutical company, and some of the other words that we use for pharmaceutical companies are industry or sponsor. All of those words are interchangeable. They all mean the same thing. But I think in this presentation, you'll see the word industry and partner, and that's just referring to a pharmaceutical company. So at Zentria, but I think also for most pharmaceutical companies that are in the space, we hope to see ourselves as a partner. We're here to advance challenging drug development that addresses unmet needs where greater levels of collaboration, tenacity, and partnership are demanded. Getting into just a high-level drug development overview. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but to just give you an idea of sort of the steps along the way that the industry partner needs to, those milestones that we need to hit to get the drug one step closer to the finish line. So starting on the left, early discovery, that's just trying to figure out how does the drug work. You're at the lab, you're at the bench, you're trying to see if it's hitting its target, what is the basic mechanism of action of a certain drug. With that data, you then progress to that next stage, and you go to the FDA. The FDA reviews this data. They look at it to ensure safety and to just make sure you're not crazy and that your data and your science is making sense early on. And then you, together with the FDA, clarify that path forward of the studies that you plan to take in the next steps. Moving on to preclinical development. Preclinical just means that it's not yet into humans, it's not yet into patients. And so it could be animal studies, but here it's where some more scientific and structured studies happen to measure the toxicology of the drug, to further understand the proof of concept of is this drug working, before we take it into human participants. Moving forward to clinical development, that is when the study drug is used in healthy volunteers and then in patients who are living with the condition. All of that data, then that gets packaged into that regulatory submission, or what that means is the regulatory body is the FDA. All of that data gets presented to the FDA so that they can review it, see if it meets their standards of a safe and effective drug. Then the FDA will then move it to that last milestone, which is hopefully the outcome is approval. After approval, there's still ongoing research that continues to occur. Clinicians will collect data, the pharma companies will collect data to make sure that long-term safety in this drug, in the given patient population, continues to be studied. So pulling from the MRCT, which is the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard, inclusion and equity in research starts with evidence, information, and trust. That is something that I'm sure everyone here has heard. So building trust, it truly starts with building trust. Pharma companies, I think most companies believe it, but I think every company says it. It's really in how the company executes its clinical trial to truly prove that they're committed to this idea of inclusion and equity. A lot of great research has been published by Dr. Kosher, the other speakers that we had this morning, researchers in this room to help capture the levels of mistrust that are felt and the biases experienced by patients in sarcoidosis. And I think that's one really important part of what we call research in the community, to help sort of provide a holistic view in a data sense of what patients are going through day to day. Patient-centered drug development continues to highlight that clinical trials should address the questions of importance to a community, be designed with study outcomes that people care about, of course, use language and words that people understand, and be conducted in ways that decrease the burden for the patients. Of course, everyone needs to hold each other accountable, and pharmaceutical companies need to be held accountable themselves. So, what we know, knowing all of that, inclusion and equity in research, it starts with trust. Oh, my whole slide's up. Then why placebo, right? What is the need for placebo? Or, as our friend is saying, why though? So placebo is a substance that looks like the real medicine but has no active ingredients. It's used in clinical trials to compare against the actual drug being tested. The purpose of a placebo, which I'll get into it helps determine if the drug is genuinely effective, or if the people in the clinical trials are just feeling better by thinking they're taking the treatment. That's what's called the placebo effect. It helps to ensure that the results of the trial are reliable and that they're accurate. Of course, with historical context, the mistrust, especially in the Black community, it stems from unethical medical and research procedures, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study. So in the nature of building trust, I think what I would like to do here today is walk through the industry sponsor's perspective on drug development and why we continue to need placebo in our clinical trials. So from the industry sponsor, when you're making your business case, you got to go to your boss. Hey, we're in discovery. We found this molecule. We really think it works. What are we going to do? We're going to look at the target market. So what that means, the market is what condition are we looking to modify or cure? For this case, of course, it's sarcoidosis. Awesome. I've heard sarcoidosis is a great community. We have sarcoidosis. Now we look into which symptoms, tests, or blood markers help diagnose this condition. As we've heard today with Dr. Culver saying, there are some blood markers, but those tools or those markers used in isolation really aren't helpful or shouldn't be used for diagnosis and truly dictating what your treatment is. But they do exist. We move on to sort of assessing the market needs. What is the level of unmet need for effective and accessible treatment options? And then which symptoms, tests, or blood markers prove that a certain drug is working? When you're in the clinic, if you're starting a new drug, what is your physician testing? What blood markers are they looking at, if any, to see that a certain drug is working? A sponsor's drug aims to prevent or treat the symptoms of a chronic disease. So all of this market research gets tied into how they believe the drug works in that specific condition. So for sarcoidosis, this is a holistic view of the market assessment. We know it's a rare disease in the United States, but also globally. It has a very diverse presentation. It can involve many different organs, but diverse presentation means diverse set of symptoms. There's a huge unmet need. There's currently no FDA-approved drugs other than steroids, Aclar gel. The systemic therapy, with a large majority of patients who do fall into that advanced category requiring therapy, and then 30 to 50% having more chronic progressive disease. Off-label use, meaning a lot of patients are required to use drugs off-label and face insurance and reimbursement challenges like we heard about before. And then assessing the standard of care, which involves right now really steroids. So there's that high level of steroid toxicity. So taking that into that market research, market assessment, we move on to try to figure out what the gaps are, right? When we're designing a clinical trial, what are the challenges in a certain disease state? So what we know, it's a small number of patients in sarcoidosis. Diverse manifestations means different symptoms in different individuals. There's a limited understanding of the disease's natural history. So Dr. Bonham spoke on this a little bit this morning. There are, some registry studies out there that can do research on certain cohorts or certain presentations or clusters of sarcoidosis, but because of the diverse nature of all the symptoms, it doesn't fit into a pretty box. And so what they say is natural history or real-world evidence that doesn't exist for sarcoidosis yet. So the lack of that natural history is just one of the gaps that we need to overcome. In the United States, as we've heard, the burden of sarcoidosis disproportionately impacts Blacks or African Americans. There's historical mistrust, the fear of discrimination, there's underrepresentation in most clinical trials, health disparities, and then a huge need for rebuilding trust. So what the FDA requires is to estimate the magnitude of effect that may provide clinically meaningful benefit. That sounds super easy, right? So when you talk to the FDA and speak to the FDA, what do they perceive as a clinically meaningful benefit? They say it's FVC for pulmonary sarcoidosis. So forced vital capacity, which is after you get your PFT test, forced vital capacity is one of those outputs. Great, I'm doing my market research, FDA says FVC, let's move forward with that. Part of what we also do is that holistic view. So we talk to healthcare providers, we talk to patients, we also talk to payers. So payers aren't on this, but I do want to acknowledge it based on this morning's question. When we talk to healthcare providers and patients, they say, you're looking at FVC. When a patient's at home and you're saying, I don't feel well, I can't speak for you, but I don't think that anyone says, let me check my FVC to make sure I'm not feeling well, right? Like that doesn't happen. I think when you're at the doctor's, they don't say, oh, you're telling me this list of symptoms, let me check your FVC to make sure that it's where it needs to be, so then I can think about what treatments to change, modify, or add on. When we talk to payers, they do talk about FVC, and they have their own algorithm that they sort of see based on the off-label use and what they consider clinically meaningful. And that's something that we also have to take into account because we want to have a competitive advantage, but we just want to make sure that the data that we're collecting can put up a fight when it comes to the payers and what they're expecting. So knowing both of these sides, or all sides of the coin, the sponsor is in the middle trying to figure it out. So that's not me, but it is me a little bit, most days. So the valley of clinical trial death is something that is very common in rare diseases, not just sarcoidosis. So as you'll see here, and this has been published, but getting from preclinical testing, so the earlier phases of drug development, over to clinical implementation, which means post-FDA approval, there's what is called a valley of clinical trial death. And it's just because it is so difficult to meet those milestones and truly push a drug to hit each milestone all the way to approval, that drugs, companies, or opportunities just fall off because the data is not there to meet each step along the way. Some of the causes for this, it's the biological heterogeneity. So again, it's a complex disease. That means it's going to need a complex solution, but there's also just a diverse presentation of the symptoms. There's no formal representation for biology. What that means is that there's no easy animal models per se that truly mimics how sarcoidosis acts for us to test drugs before they get into patients. There are ways, like Dr. Bonham described earlier, that we can have a granuloma in a petri dish and then put our drug in it and watch the granuloma decrease. That's a positive signal. But there's no true animal model that some other disease states do have, which it gives them an advantage. But those are some of the pitfalls that are in that clinical trial valley. So in real life, I'm not a very high impact active person, believe it or not. Like, I'm not a mountaineer. I don't, anyway, so I'm not a trekker, but I think in drug development, and I think similar to why patients are called sarcoidosis warriors, you really need to be able and be prepared to sort of fight that battle, or sort of try to traverse this valley of not death, but misinformation, or this valley of data that you need to support to get to wherever you're trying to go. So I think the toolbox that patients, clinicians, and then industry sponsors need to have, we really need to do every single thing that we can to get the strongest amount of data into our clinical trials. So again, putting the industry hat on, going into a rare disease, sort of a market assessment, I'm ready to design my clinical trial. I go to the FDA and I look at their guidance for industry sponsors. It says that considerations for natural history studies could help make clinical trials. You could do shorter trials, you could do, adaptive trials if you have a strong understanding of the disease natural history. Unfortunately, as we've heard, we don't have that just yet. But you know what, that's okay, we'll go on to the next consideration. We should consider the use of biomarkers. And those predictive biomarkers, or biomarkers that work in interpreting if a drug is working or not. Unfortunately, as we've already talked about, we have those biomarkers, but we don't want to be so isolated, and we also don't have that tight range that represents and truly reflects what each patient is going through. But you know what, that's okay. We'll integrate the biomarkers, but we don't have that to lean on and to bolster our approach. Endpoint selection. The FDA would like us to select endpoints that helps understand the clinical characteristics of a drug and the outcome sort of working for the patient. So aspects of the disease that are meaningful for the patient and the caregivers. That could, in your activities of daily life, what you consider clinically meaningful could just be having a good day, going for a walk, being able to maintain a conversation, at a party in the evening, and being able to be present and enjoy without feeling pain or feeling overly fatigued. To a doctor, to the FDA, to a payer, that means it means different things. So for us, we as industry sponsors, we really need to rely on data to inform how well a therapy is working. And unfortunately, that is with the addition of placebo. The action or the addition of placebo happens during phase 2 and phase 3 trials, which is why to date, and probably in the near future, you'll see that placebo-controlled trials are what is available right now. So the placebo in the trial, it ensures that accurate results can help researchers understand if the new treatment is truly effective. So by comparing the new drug to a placebo, we can see if the improvements are due to the drug itself, or like other factors, it could be due to other factors like hope or expectation, like the placebo effect that I spoke about earlier. The placebo, it helps control for bias, so it reduces the chance that results are influenced by participants or a doctor's belief about the treatments. This can help make the study more objective and more reliable. And then it helps balance the study. So it's a great control group for comparing outcomes. It helps to confirm that any observed benefits are due to the new treatment and not just due to a coincidence. Placebos, though, are not the only parameter that we as industry use to apply in our toolbox to help bridge us from that preclinical work over to clinical implementation or a post-approval. But it really is during these phase 2 and 3 trials that we need to implement it. So going back to assessing the challenges in drug development, with what we do know, we know that we need to use placebos, but there are ways that we can implement it that makes it still beneficial or more advantageous for the patients. we can randomize trials to help increase the chance of getting an active therapy over placebo. So for example, Zentria is doing a clinical trial right now in pulmonary sarcoidosis with a 3-to-1 randomization ratio. What that means is that for every 4 patients who are enrolled in the trial, 3 patients have the chance of being on active drug, and only 1 of those 4 patients will be on placebo. So we're not saying for every 1 patient on active drug, it's 1 placebo, it's a 3-to-1. So we're still trying to increase as many patients as possible, their chance of having active drug, and we're still then trying to appease the FDA by showing we're doing a placebo-controlled trial. We do have some placebo patients. Lessons learned by pharma companies who've already completed their phase 2 trial. They learned that in placebo patients, when they performed a steroid taper in sarcoidosis patients, some patients didn't get worse. And that's because they were actually overdosed on steroids. And so it's good to know that, from a clinician point of view, you might be giving your patients too high of steroids so they can lower them and then in turn lower the toxicity. But those are some of those lessons learned from a placebo group that we need to continue to apply to sarcoidosis research moving forward. We as industry sponsors, we don't benefit from having more patients on placebo than active therapy. For us, we really, again, need strong data, but we need strong data from both data sets. And we do have ongoing research from amazing researchers and clinicians in the space. WASOG, which is sort of the International American Association of SARC group, they're working and continuously working on clinical trial endpoints by building a task force and doing a really robust scientific sort of review and intervention to ensure we're moving forward, or the space is moving forward in the right way. So going back to estimating the magnitude of effect that may provide clinically meaningful benefit, it's a balancing act, right? Like Dr. Culver said, it's that teeter-totter. As an industry sponsor in the middle, we sort of need to look at what the FDA is requiring, look at what the doctors and the patients are doing, but do our best to make a data set that, if it's focused on pulmonary, we can do as much as we can to design it to look at the other organ involvement and extrapulmonary manifestations, because we really only get one shot to do this trial, and so everything that we can do to help make it as widely available when it's approved, that's going to leave all of us in the best position. So, in summary, we went over these first 3. Why placebo? It ensures accurate results. It helps control for bias. It balances the study. It avoids the risk of giving patients an unproven treatment that might not work. So patient trials, it can be 30 patients, it can be 100 patients. That's still pretty small, right? If we didn't have placebo, we didn't have sort of this rigorous understanding of the data that is reproducible. If it then gets opened up to all sarcoidosis patients, it could be even more unsafe when it gets to those later stages. And then lastly, from the regulatory requirements, the regulatory agency, meaning the FDA, the placebo-controlled trial shows them that it was conducted and that the data that they're looking at can prove that it's a safe and effective drug that they're approving to make available for patients. So overall, the drug development process, it's a holistic approach. It involves so many different stakeholders, but so many different touch points. Communication and transparency are key, but overall the goal of a drug development program is to demonstrate the effectiveness of a drug in treating or preventing a disease. So with that holistic approach, we still need to talk about the importance of placebo given the historical mistrust, but we want to build the trust and build that transparency. So along the way of that clinical development path, as we're trekking, over that valley of clinical trial death, we should be sharing the results as they go, publishing on the data that we have, communicating that so that you guys know as patients the work that is going on and the data that's coming out as we're leading sort of milestone to milestone on that path to approval. With that intent to translate, we really hope that that patients can understand that need for placebo, and also understand that The placebo using placebo in a clinical trial is just one step needed in this entire toolbox or holistic approach to progress on that clinical trial roadmap in the hopes of getting a treatment that works for patients. So thank you guys for your time.